Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Day's flying by. We're just going to wait for a few minutes as everybody gets logged on to our Zoom webinar. Okay. It still seems like we need to wait just a minute or two to see if anybody else shows up. Okay, I think we haven't had any more joining for the last minute or so, so we're ready to start. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Spring Gardening Webinar Series presented by Central Oregon Master Gardeners, Oregon State University, and our sponsors. Thank you for joining us this beautiful April day. My name is Becky Nurchik, and I will be your host. The other Master Gardeners assisting behind the scenes today is Deborah Wenzel. Our presenter is Dana Sanchez, who will be discussing the overlap between home ranges of human and wild creatures increases. She will cover basic ecology or facts of life for several species that are commonly involved in interactions and address tactics we humans can employ in efforts to avoid or manage prospective conflicts. But first, some housekeeping for our webinar. All videos and microphones are off except for the presenters. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them in the Q&A window. We will reserve time at the end to answer anything that was not addressed during the slide presentation. The presentation is being recorded and will be available online for a short period of time following the session. A few days after the session, you will be sent an email link to access the recording. We will also send you any links that Dana mentions in her presentation. Dana Sanchez studies mammals and their associated neighbors in native ecosystems, frequently in areas where humans and the wildlife share habitat. Her extension work focuses on demystifying species ecology and potential sparks for conflict between humans and the wild animals in their midst in order to support sustainable management of wildlife while preserving conflicts damaging to both sides. As a first-generation scholar with intersecting historically excluded identities, she works as a mentor and leader to broaden equitable and inclusive participation in STEM. At this point, I will turn things over to Dana.
Can you hear me and see my slides? All right.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that great introduction, and thank you all for joining us. I have quite a few slides, but I hope we'll have time and interest in discussion towards the end. Let's see if we can get the slides to work. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit in terms of concepts that are going to be helpful for us to understand our interactions with animals. The reason we're all here is that we are sharing habitat. And habitat is a very species-specific thing. We humans have managed to become quite generalist in our habitat use, but for most of the creatures on the earth, habitat is a specific combination of factors, both living and non-living, that are necessary to first allow members of that species to even occupy a location, and then furthermore to survive and ultimately to successfully reproduce. And then habitat quality is specifically speaking to the abundance, quality, or accessibility of the resources that that creature needs to make a living there. And it can even include things that are not so immediately obvious, like safety from predation. A lot of the creatures we're going to talk about today are in fact prey species, meaning that they are food for other animals. So safety, ability to access food, for example, and safely get away if they are charged or something attempts to eat them is a very critical uh, part of their equation. In terms of our interactions with animals, I ask folks to slow down. Quite often I hear from folks because something has become an acute or a newly noticed issue of damage or interaction or things like that. And we need to take a breath quite often and just take an assessment of what the situation is. And there are multiple steps in that. And I will say that this first bullet point, are there health or safety concerns for human beings? I have that at the top of the list because I call them kind of my red card or red flag things that I listen for when I hear about an interaction between human beings and wild animals. I will say that these types of risks or concerns are the least common, but again, they are the ones that go the highest in terms of we need to do something right away. Then the rest of it, beyond that first kind of critical level, is how serious is the problem? I do sometimes get inquiries from people who are simply reporting the presence of a wild animal in a space that they see as theirs, whether that is a fox trotting down the road or a particular animal in their yard or things like that. So that's probably until there's an interaction that's damaging or of concern, it's simply an occurrence. Oh, that their habitat and your habitat are overlapping, so you are both present in that species. So the definition of the problem then is really one of reflection on our part. Is it is the interaction insignificant, tolerable? So, for example, all of us can accept some munching on our landscape plants, or is it beyond acceptable? And then what is the context? And part of that, a big consideration is the geographic scale. Are we talking about your yard or a particular set of garden beds or your whole neighborhood or a focal path? Because our options for mitigating that interaction are really dependent on the scale, the geographic scale and size of what we're going to attempt to do. And then another one that is not always immediately apparent when we think about this as an interaction between me and this wild animal is the human dimension. So, for example, is somebody near your house feeding the deer, and is that creating a conflict between the deer in your landscaping or the deer in your safety? I have a lot of conversations here in Corvallis about urban turkeys, for example. And I think that there should probably be a corollary to Murphy's Law of when I'm getting somebody who is extremely upset about either being chased by turkeys, having their car windows broken by pecking turkeys, or even having their roof destroyed by scratching turkeys, that there's a good chance that someone within a few households is feeding the turkeys. So the turkeys have now established this part of the neighborhood as the place where they can go get plenty to eat for the whole flock. And then a few doors down, they all roost on that person's roof or vehicles for their nightly safety. So those conversations, the human interactions, are often the ones that people are most hesitant to take up, but are sometimes the most important to take up in order to deal with the human wildlife conflict. And then another issue is the scale of time. Is a problem or a conflict or a damage something that was a one and done, or is it seasonal? So every season part, a certain part of the season. A good example of this would be flickers hammering on vent stacks and things like that, and then trying to nest, creating their own cavities in the sides of houses and other wood clad structures. So there tends to be a seasonal pattern to that. And we can take those things into account again when we're thinking about what can we do. So regardless of the species, we have some basic tactics. The first and probably the most preferable when we can manage it is to anticipate based on what species might be occurring in the area into which we are moving, or into which we are building a new home or a new community. What creatures are there? What types of soils and plants are there? And then anticipate, given how we are going to inhabit and use and expect from that piece of property, what are the potential negative interactions, and let's take options to prevent there from being a problem. However, many of us are moving into homes and neighborhoods that already exist. The local wildlife exists and interactions are already happening, and we may have to retrofit some things. Then another very common tactic that we can take is to modify the habitat to reduce how many animals essentially can fit within that space. And there are different ways that we can do that. There is the option also of blocking entry, or excluding, or simply blocking access to a surface. When you think about the flickers I just mentioned, simply preventing them from being able to make contact with whatever they are damaging. And then the last option is to remove the animals from the situation. And I'm going to have more to say about that. So I mentioned this concept of carrying capacity. Essentially, again, it is the population size of that species that can be supported by the resources in that space. We're usually talking about food, especially in the suburban, urban, and rural interface between humans and wild animals. And what these yellow lines are showing, the dotted yellow line, is rising from the starting point of whenever those animals started living in that area, and what their population will do is rise towards that dotted top red line, the initial carrying capacity. So their population will rise to fill the space and the food capacity of that area. And then that line kind of goes up and down. It waves along there. So animal population size can go slightly above the optimal space or food available, and then the population will decline because animals don't get quite enough to eat or to raise healthy offspring. So it will go down and then it will come back up. And it we biologists say that as oscillation about K, or K being the carrying capacity. Now, typically when we go in to manage numbers of animals, we want to just squash that population size down by removing animals. But if we have not taken that management to reduce the habitat quality, or essentially the carrying capacity, to that lower red line, then when we get done removing animals, what we're actually going to see is a population spring back up, because the carrying capacity is still there, the access is still there, and actually there are new opportunities for fresh animals to be produced and to do quite well in that space. So that's something to think about when we are moving into a place, whether that is food, or in Central and Eastern Oregon, it can even be something as simple as water, because water is relatively rare in those environments. There are many different ways we might exclude animals from areas that we want to, or even individual plants we want to protect. These are pictures of just a few. The one on the bottom right is illustrating a piece of essentially just sheet metal around a tree trunk that we want to stop tree squirrels from going up, or other climbing animals from going up. So that's, I know that diagram isn't the greatest. The other photos are pretty clear though. I said I was going to talk more about reducing populations via lethal removal of animals. Species diagnosis before we use a trap, set a trap or a snare, or certainly when we are choosing synthetic rodenticides or pesticides, knowing what exactly we are, quote, treating for is really vital. There's the ethical issue, and then there's also making sure that we're choosing the right tool to target the species we are planning to remove. We also have to think about that annual cycle for that particular species, their seasonal patterns, how environmental conditions and the site itself might affect our ability to be effective with different tools available to us. And I will just put a plug in here. I know that you are all likely already very versed in this as master gardeners and master naturalists, but the label is the law when we are using something, whether we are combating an insect or a vertebrate animal. The specificity as far as what animals and what systems and setting or crop or yard are all absolutely specified and have to be followed as on the label. And if people know this, everybody who has access to using these products is certainly able to appreciate this, and yet every year we have secondary impacts of pesticides, including rodenticides, because people violate the label, either in the timing or the manner in which they apply the chemical. And some of the most severe, I would say every year to 3 years, we have, for example, more than 10,000 geese killed per event, because somebody decides to violate the seasonal restriction on broadcast applications of zinc phosphide. These chemicals and traps have no idea what creature is encountering them. So the decision of the wise use, again, lies with us. There are more and more documentations of secondary effects that were not fully appreciated when many of these chemical tools were initially distributed for use, some of them decades ago. But when we're thinking about trying to employ native predators, for example, to help us manage some of the native rodents, we want to make sure that we are not actually removing our allies or poisoning them, um, much less other humans or our pets. When it comes to population reduction, whether we're talking about squirrels or bears or deer or anything else, people like ourselves frequently want to do the kindest thing, and we would rather just, quote, move them somewhere else so that they can be, quote, happy somewhere else. The reason that is not a viable or legal action, and it's certainly not the kindest option for the animal, is that when we translocate animals, they frankly have very low survival. If you can imagine what would happen to a human being if we uh, picked you up and just moved you, like, even if you weren't traumatized by being captured and transported, we moved you and set you in some stranger's home, that there would be what we call intraspecific aggression. You would likely be injured or at least chased very hard when the occupant of that home attempted to eject you. This happens with animals as well. Additionally, you would not know what the potential dangers were in that neighborhood, and you would try to get home. And similarly, animals are amazingly good at attempting to home back to where they were removed from. In so doing, they expose themselves to any number of risks, as you can imagine, roads, other animals. They are generally so stressed that they don't stop to eat, and they aren't familiar enough with that locale to be able to readily find appropriate amounts of high quality food. And there are all kinds of disruptions to the receiving population that could include social issues as well as disease and parasite transmission. Um, all of these reasons are why it's illegal unless this is done by a professional wildlife agency. And we don't do it very often in our field anymore, that it's illegal. So please, when we're talking about reducing populations, resist the urge to simply move the problem. It's not going to to work out well for relieving your problem, nor is it going to turn out well likely for that animal. All right. Now, I know when I was first contacted about this talk, and I promise, get to some of the diggers and rodents and deer. The bear issue hadn't flared up again quite as much as it has very recently. I don't know if you're aware or not, but Corvallis was essentially losing our collective mind at 3 in the morning the Sunday before last because there was a bear on the OSU campus. And then subsequently, a week later, it showed up in Philomath, or a bear. We're not sure if it was the same bear. And the reason I mention bears is that you all are fortunate enough to actually live in well-established bear country. And that's wonderful. They're a very important part of the system there. But their bears are among the species that are highly intelligent and unfortunately, therefore, very vulnerable to learning very bad, dangerous habits from human beings. There are two forms of learning I want to talk about, and bears are not the only ones that learn these things. So you'll see I inserted a warning sign that I took a picture of up in the Waterton National Park in Canada of a person being assaulted by an elk. Habituation is a form of learning by wild animals, actually by all of us, but we're going to talk about wild animals today. It's a behavioral acclimation, essentially, to human beings. Essentially, they lose their natural fear of us, and we are mega predators. They should have some natural fear and hesitation to be near us, or our noises, or our smells, or anything associated with human beings and human dominated spaces. What habituation can mean when that lowered fear happens is that the tolerance for nearness decreases. So that we can get closer and they can get closer before essentially their fight or flight trigger is hit. And that can also lead to animals habituating to getting near us for resources, whether that is food or cover or safety. And essentially the human word we use for that is they become somewhat entitled to that. They take ownership of that. So you can see increased aggressiveness or competition with domesticated animals. So for example, when we have habituated or urbanized coyotes, foxes, or eventually there will likely be urbanized wolves, then they see our domesticated dogs as competitors that look very like them, but something that needs to be eliminated in order to successfully compete for that bowl of food that didn't get eaten earlier in the day, for example. Now, those habituated individuals who have lost that natural fear, that natural desire to be as far from us as possible, they are that much more vulnerable to what we call food conditioning, which is essentially the same form of learning that you and I use when we want to train our cat or dog or horse to come when we give it a treat. Okay, and you'll probably be very familiar with that saying that fed bears are dead bears. And so a couple things to remember here. These habituation and food conditioning lessons can happen without humans meaning to teach the animals these things. Now, there are some times and some human beings that are certainly guilty of deliberately attempting to, quote, make friends or, quote, tame wild animals because they are probably just so fascinated with those creatures that they just want to get closer. But an awful lot of habituation and food conditioning happens inadvertently. I mentioned that food that's left out on the back porch for Fifi or Brutus that doesn't get eaten, but boy, the traveling raccoon starts knowing that you and your back porch are a reliable source of that food. They lose their fear of being in your yard, and then they start taking that food for granted. So we have to be very, very watchful and careful. You, again, are in a part of the state that is so fortunate to have bears and elk and deer and coyotes and foxes and all manner of animals that are very highly intelligent and unfortunately easily trained. So I just want to make sure that um, we keep these things in mind always. There are some fantastic resources that are very specific to bears at this bearsmart.com site. There is news in there, recommendations in there that may be hard for us to enjoy receiving. I know they're hard for me, but I am finding myself going back to the Bear Smart guidelines. I own chickens. I have a bird feeder inside my inner yard for the wild passerine birds. And each of those things are things that now that I know without a doubt that bears are visiting my neighborhood, that I will have to consider stopping doing because I don't want to train bears to hang out in my yard. So I would highly recommend looking up that set of resources for bears specifically. Okay, now I heard from Vicki that there are some deer and maybe even elk issues there, and I can certainly imagine that being the case. Um, how do you know a deer has been around? Well, you see the deer or the elk in the yard, you see some hoof prints, you see pellets, although I just mentioned to you as an extension wildlife specialist, I get lots and lots of pictures of poop of all different forms. And in the springtime, like we are right now, when things are so green and lush and full of water, those nice, neat little pellets that come out of deer and elk and other creatures like that, they can just turn into big plops. So it's not unusual in the spring and then during that fall flush of very moist vegetation for people to start thinking that they've had a bear, for example, in their front yard when really it's a deer that's just been eating a whole lot of really moist food. But generally, the scat and the pellets are a good indicator that deer have been around. Sometimes you'll even see the tamp down areas if you have deer, quote, bedding or lying down at night in your area or in the snow. They can make some fairly distinct little, well, they're not little, they're pretty good sized deer shaped impressions in the vegetation or the duff. They do, especially the males in late summer, early fall, may do what people call horning, which is really rubbing antlers on trees to remove the skin layer or velvet from the hardened antlers. And depending on the how high up the vegetation damages can help us discern whether we are looking at deer or elk, including standing on hind legs. Now, it mentions here the jagged or torn surfaces on vegetation. So here are a few photos. One on the upper left is it's actually a simulated skull of a deer. And the point I wanted to make with this photo is you'll see that they have lower incisor or front teeth, and they have no upper incisors. So what they have instead is essentially a keratin pad. Think about our gums, but much tougher. And so they bite the ends of stems between those lower incisors and that pad or gum on their upper jaw. And then they have to snip or tear things off. And right below that skull, you can see examples of twigs with that kind of torn edge. It results from the equipment, essentially, that the deer is clipping plants with. And then there are some additional examples of clipping up in the upper right. And in the lower right, you can see what we call a browse line. So that is where there is heavy feeding about as high as those animals can reach consistently across a row of plants there. Deer are ruminant herbivores. What in the world does that mean? Well, it means they've got a couple stomachs and they eat plants. And so they require high quality, highly digestible nutrients. And they have to keep eating them and processing those plants through the chambers of their stomach. Their breeding and then their birthing season are timed to take best advantage of greatest available food to support not just the adults, but to support the lactating mothers. Now, in a heavily harvested population, deer probably live a maximum of 2 to maybe even 4 or 5 years old. But where protected or less hunted or fewer predators, deer can live quite some time. I would say that females, whether they're hunted in a hunted population or not, females tend to live longer simply because they are not engaged in combat. Males compete with each other to be able to mate with females, and they also, during what the breeding season that's called rut, the males will literally be running around, losing their minds, chasing each other, chasing females, and that doesn't go well where there are roads and predators. So the females do tend to be able to hang in there longer. And then in hunted populations, people are very hesitant to shoot females. Females are the kind of the head of deer societies. They are matriarchal. And in fact, females, some people call them clans, share overlapping geographic ranges or home ranges, whereas the males, as they begin to reach sexual maturity, are generally kicked out of the family area so that they don't accidentally breed with female relatives. But what that can mean is that you'll have multiple generations of female deer or elk who have experienced your neighborhood. And some of that learning that I was talking about earlier, certainly it makes sense for nature to have given them a way of teaching their offspring, eat this, but not that, or here's a good place for salt or water, things like that. But they can also very easily start teaching them, like, oh, this house always fills their bird feeder, and we don't really eat bird seed, but it's quite tasty and high energy. So I say that because I have been guilty of helping teach some wildland interface deer females about bird seed. And then when I realized what was happening, of course, I had to take the feeder down. But those fawns of that year continued to show up even after mom was gone. So I saw those fawns as yearlings and 2-year-olds still coming back just to check whether there was a little pot of food there for them. So that kind of learning can really persist across generations where you have those matrilineal clans on the landscape. Now, earlier, I mentioned preventing the conflict, and here's an example specific to deer. If you've bought a new to you home, for example, and there is a deer trail through the yard or through the property, then you know that if you don't want deer traipsing through your landscape, you're probably going to have to interrupt that deer trail with a fence that is deer proof, either high or with electricity or something like that. Otherwise, the deer will continue to access that area via that trail. Another thing to think about is that, as I mentioned earlier, deer need to maximize not just the quantity of food they eat, but the quality. And native plants, I'm going to plug native plants a lot. I'll start it here. Native plants have evolved with the native things that eat plants. And so there's kind of an arms race that as a given plant gets browsed by a deer, for example, year after year, it starts forming more wood, and it may even start investing in making plant secondary compounds that essentially make it less tasty. So there's a relationship between the eaters and the eaten. Now, when we choose landscape plants from other parts of the world where there are not our deer, and then we water them and feed those plants so that they are healthy and they make blossoms or they grow really vigorously, you realize that we are putting out the highest quality food on that local landscape. And deer and other animals will figure that out. So we need to think very carefully again as we inhabit the shared area of habitat, what signals we are going to send out to the wild animals that are using that area. I've already mentioned, please do not deliberately feed or lure deer or any other wild animal. So I've already mentioned quite a bit of this. And the people often and very commonly, understandably, ask about deer-proof plants. Um, Ideally, we're going to look at native plants that have already been engaged in that arms race over ecological time to be able to essentially protect themselves without getting eaten to the ground by the native plant eating animals in the area. If we are not going to choose native plants, then we should probably choose plants according to their ability to protect themselves, either things that have thorns or things that we know smell really strongly, um, have those secondary compounds, like the natural sagebrush smell is a good signal for example, to wild animals, that this plant has compounds in it that will make sure that you cannot make a good living off of it. Additionally, what I've found is because local deer populations have literally their own uh, list of tolerances, your most local extension master gardeners generally have a better idea, and your very local nurseries have a better idea of what the deer and elk in your area are currently not eating as much. I also talked about excluding animals. I just have a few slides here for us to think about. Again, that geographic area, like if I need to quote, keep the, fill in the animal out, how much space do you need to keep them out of? And what are the abilities of that animal to get across a barrier? Now, we all know that deer can jump. So if we want to long term keep deer out away from certain plants, we need a fence that can stand up to their abilities to jump. They also can, we think about the size and the tactics that the animals will use to defeat a barrier between them and yummy, nutritious food, and realize that deer, but especially larger deer like elk, they are very persistent. So if you have a fence that is not put solidly in the ground like this one with the big poles, they will lean it down or they will walk it down, just literally exactly what it sounds like. By literally leaning on it and pushing on it, they can push fences down. Now, the top right picture has got a hot wire on top of a not very tall fence, but sometimes, although I'm talking about deer and elk right now, sometimes people are needing to exclude things like carnivores such as coyotes from a pasture, and sometimes having that hot wire on the top, and I would also recommend in that case out towards the wild animals to help make more of a barrier with greater deterrence. Now, having said that, keeping electricity working outdoors can be very challenging. Uh, Plants fall on it, snow happens, poles fall down, neighbors back into posts, batteries wear down, rodents chew wires, things like that. But used carefully and with the cost of maintenance, it can be a very helpful addition to many fence designs. Now, these are a couple of these next two slides are examples from my former neighborhood here in Corvallis. And you probably are already all very well versed in this, but I just want to let you see uh, what I would see on a dog walk through a Corvallis neighborhood with people attempting to use our urbanized or attempting to exclude our urbanized population of deer. So you see on the bottom left, a very effective deer-proof fence. And then that same owner also had a specimen plant they wanted to protect outside that fence. And that system of poles and tautly stretched netting worked for that plant. And then you may or may not be able to see it, but there are some individual cages that were pinned down to the ground that were also quite effective, even though those were outside the bigger fence. And then actually, if I had turned the other way down that same path, you have a perennially not effective fence. So if you look at the number of different attempts and materials, essentially just turning into a heap of materials, attempting to block, you can see the deer path through there. The deer are still going right past that whole mess right into that yard. And this was actually a picture shared not from my neighborhood, but from a fellow wildlife biologist who confessed that they had, been so busy and they just threw something up on some poles and kind of forgot about it. And then we got a late snow, and this is what it looked like afterwards. So that's not really a fence. So, another consideration is to not create a problem fence. So movement of animals across landscapes is simply part of what they do and they have to do in order to find enough food to support themselves. So we do want to think about species and the relationship to the whole landscape when we are choosing fence materials. There are, to get back to that scale, scope, and purpose, total exclusion with fences of whatever type is really most feasible at limited scales. All right. Deterrence is another thing that people would like to work in an ideal world. That is essentially the challenge of convincing an animal to not want something that it knows is good for it. So we can try not just deer, the bangers and shell crackers and propane cannons are very common, for example, here in the valley with uh, geese. But some of these deterrents are also tried with everything from geese to deer to bears and just about everything else. Now, in an urbanizing area, even if you're in a semi-rural area, realize that things like shock and awe are also going to have an effect on your fellow human beings. So they are regulated as such. Some localized deterrents can essentially be a non-fenced fence. This type of tool, so it's a jet of water. Obviously, there would be a seasonal consideration here. This isn't something you would want to put out in the middle of winter or that you'd be able to keep unfrozen during the middle of winter. But during the warmer season, people sometimes use these, but there are, again, considerations of how far this type of deterrent reaches. So you would not want this situated such that it was just spraying your neighbors or the mailman or other people, passers-by. You have to use this with some careful consideration. And then finally, thinking more about deer, this is again back in my former uh, residence. Actually, as I was backing out of my driveway one morning, these are some of our highly urbanized, habituated deer in the Timber Hill neighborhood. And so there are a couple things there. There is clear dietary selection in a very non-native planting area. And then you'll notice the juvenile that is carefully watching what mom and auntie are eating to take notes on what is good to eat. Making animals not want food that they know to recognize as food simply by taste and smell is a pretty tough proposition. There are commercial products available. I have used some of them. They all are going to need to be reapplied either after rain or exposure to prolonged sun. So UV rays can be just as tough on chemicals that are sticking to leaves as rain. they generally lack replicated tests of effectiveness, so I don't have any science to offer you saying this one is, quote, effective compared to that one. And again, habituation also extends to bad tastes and smells. Just like you and I can get used to certain noises, the tooting of the train, or the occasional smell from the dairy fertilizing its fields, or things like that. Animals also get habituated to tastes and smells. So we have to rotate products, even if we do find one that is effective for 4 to 6 weeks. Now, removing animals, lethally removing animals, when they are game animals, meaning things that are hunted and trapped by permit from the state agency, you need to talk to your ODFW district biologist. So they are the ones who are tasked with sustainable population management over landscapes over time. All right, moving along. I also heard that there are some rabbits that might be chewing on some of your yard's landscaping. You are happen to be in an area that is rich in rabbit species, but the most common ones that you should be encountering are the mountain cottontail and the black-tailed jackrabbit. Essentially, exclusion is going to be your answer. Again, scale and scope, how big an area you need to exclude from is going to be a big consideration. Consider opportunities to extend whatever fence line you have to slightly below the ground. And what you see in the bottom two, the bottom left and bottom center photos are people using hardware cloth to prevent underdigging of an existing wood fence. Now, the cottontail and the black-tailed jackrabbit don't actually tunnel, but they are certainly capable of underdigging a fence or an easy barrier that's right at ground level. So by taking hardware cloth, I wouldn't recommend the chicken wire that's showing up in that uppermost left because it will rot more easily. But using hardwire down 6 to 12 inches below surface, and then at least 6 to 12 inches out towards the wild animals so that you can't get that under digging, would be your most effective approach for keeping the bunnies out. All right. I know I am running long here, but I want to at least get into some of the burrowing animals that you might be having interactions and conflicts with. They do actually each play numerous important roles in the ecosystems, even if they are driving us nuts at the moment. I've got some pictures. All the middle and lower pictures are examples of the vole, the most common vole species we have here in the Willamette Valley. The gray-tailed vole makes lots of holes, dozens, hundreds, thousands of holes over relatively small areas. So you can see where we were using a fogger to blow smoke out of adjacent holes, and then we stuffed burlap in all the holes that the smoke came out of after just 20 or 30 seconds of blowing smoke. And then if we were going to do any sort of population management on those lower holes, we can see very fresh scat and scat associated with holes and resting sites. The other photos at the top are examples from a gopher, California ground squirrel, and moles, respectively, across the top there. So I will say that moles are not, in fact, rodents. These are solitary predators that eat invertebrates. It's quite often, except where the largest bodied mole, the Townsend's mole, shows up. In most cases, conflicts with moles are from the mole hills. So the those are hills of dirt created when the animals need to get the waste dirt out of their burrow systems. They're making those burrow systems so that they can eat invertebrate things like worms, the vertebrae of sorry, things like I'm trying to say the army cutworms, grubs, um, crane fly larvae, all of those things that live below the surface. And these are one of the things that I hear about kind of seasonally, not because they only feed or are active seasonally, but because the prey come up towards the surface seasonally according to the soil moisture and temperature conditions. So then people will report to me they disappeared, but now they're back all of a sudden. Where did they come from? It's like, well, they've always been down there. They just are now feeding closer to the surface of your yard. So you're seeing sign of them. These mole species are among those that we know the least about their ecology because, as you can imagine, it's really hard to get observations on them. They are uniquely designed, as you can see in that top upper right picture, they are uniquely designed to literally swim through soil and hunt their prey. Trapping them can be very tricky, and it really depends on finding exactly where in that run the animal is working at the current moment. Not where has it been, but where is it likely to come back to in the near future. And then we use a variety of what we call body gripping traps that essentially squish the animal when it triggers that trap with its movement. We have both striped and unstriped ground squirrels. This is just a very basic map showing where some of those species occur in general across the state of Oregon. And this is, I use two of these as a great example of why knowing exactly what kind of animal you are dealing with beyond just quote ground squirrel, if you want to understand what they're doing, when they're going to do it, all of that. So the California ground squirrel is also sometimes called the gray digger. They also manage to climb a lot, so sometimes people actually mistake them for tree squirrels that are going underground. Um, they are large. They are very generalist in what habitats they use. They have longer breeding seasons and they're active during the year and across a longer lifespan than something such as the Belding's ground squirrel, which is a very opportunistic herbivore, but it also shifts to eating insects and even animal flesh when it has to. So really adapted for drier, hot, cold, extreme types of environments. They don't live very long. Their breeding season is entirely being tweaked by just how harsh the conditions are in a given year. And so they all each of these creatures is really adapted to be able to make a living in the types of environments and the harshness that they are faced with. Now, the University of California has some wonderful best management practices. You see the link at the bottom, and I know we're running a little tight on time, so I won't go into those much beyond to say that these graphs, and I will provide slides to your hostesses here so that you can come back and look at these, but species identification and then understanding the seasonal ecology of these animals really does have a huge emphasis on and implications for what tools you might use and when you can use them and how effective you might expect to be when you're using them. These are a couple of the other squirrels that you might be seeing in your region. Again, species ecology matters. What are they doing and why are they there? Is all going to be a very species specific situation. Pocket gophers are one of the other diggers. They frequently get mixed up with moles because of the dirt that they kick out when they are making their burrow systems. So where I was talking earlier about moles, you'll see the plug in this lower left. The plug happens when the animal quits kicking dirt out of a hole and it falls a little bit back into that entrance. In moles, that plug happens in the middle of the dirt mound, and on pocket gophers, it's to the side of what people frequently call this shape here a fan. Now, pocket gophers are they are herbivores. They eat plants. They don't hibernate. They and a lot of these other burrowing animals are surprisingly very territorial. Don't come down in my burrow system. I will kick you out. Now, you would think that the same trap that would work on a pocket gopher would work for a mole, but that is not the case. We have a wide range of traps that have been designed just for pocket gophers, and the challenge is the same, figuring out where in that burrow system the animal is active at a given time. But again, species identification is very important because there are different traps that have been designed specifically to target pocket gophers as opposed to some of the other digging species. Now, I have a section in here about predators, thinking about how can we use some of the natural things that eat some of the smaller animals in particular. I know that people sometimes have a very strong negative socialization towards snakes. I used to be one of those people. But I would argue that snakes are some of the most highly adapted rodent eaters we have, and they go in burrow systems. So you might consider one, tolerating their presence if you're hesitant about that at this stage. Now, obviously, you can't let rattlesnakes take over your yard, but all these other snakes, just allowing them to move through the area, they will actually help with quite a few control issues. And some people even have the space to think about recreating some of these snake habitat structures. There's a diagram from one publication. This type of structure could provide overwintering and environmental shelter, whether it was on a very hot day or a very cold day, or over a whole winter season for snakes. We need to think about the animals that fly as our allies as well. we are blessed with a very abundant and diverse, what I call Air Force. We have numerous owls. I've just listed a few of the owls here. Uh, Also the daytime predators. Not all of these only take small mammals. So, for example, the Cooper's hawk is an example of a bird specialized predator, but they will take some mammals occasionally. So, think about them. If you do not have great horned owls, then there's a possibility that you could possibly attract barn owls. But I will tell you that great horned owls eat barn owls. So, as much as we would all love to have a pair of barn owls eating rodents for us, um, for example, here where I live, we know we've got a very abundant population of great horned owls, which is great because they eat a lot of things, but it means we are unlikely to ever be able to attract a couple of barn owls because the barn owls know better. And then the mammalian predators. Again, there are many socialized, shall we say, biases against some of these things that make a living by eating other animals. But if we're thinking about controlling some of these small bodied rodents and other animals that get into trouble in our yards, we really should consider being more welcoming of them. I think I should probably go ahead and get to some of these other points. This is a very important point that I want to get some clarity on. People frequently think that our cats or even dogs can, quote, help with control of natural rodent populations or non-native invasive species such as house mice, black rats, or brown rats. However, there is actual science now estimating real numbers that cats in the United States are killing 1.3 to over 3 billion native wild birds every year. That's regardless of whether somebody's giving them food at a home or not. And in fact, there has been a study of cats as effective in killing rats, and they flunk that test. They do not do well at that. So, in terms of being helpers for rodent control, they are not as effective at the population level, but they are in fact a major threat to native biodiversity. But I also understand as a cat owner, cats love to be outside, and here's um, some links to thinking about some great catio designs and a picture of one that's pretty darn nice down in the lower right. And then finally, thinking about our structures. Our windows are literally the windows to enjoying the natural soul outside, but they can be very damaging, not just through collisions by birds, but also by polluting the dark skies. Where you are located is some of the most priceless dark sky country uh, in the United States. And I would encourage you to, if that is not something you're familiar with, to think about the reflectance and also the light option, our options on mitigating our effects of light on migrating as well as resident birds. All right, so sorry to run so long. I know we've got some questions that have been coming in.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much. You gave us so much to think about as we garden and also enjoy the animals that are around us. So, one question here is I am in Northwest Bend, and there is new construction directly behind me that has involved the removal of dozens of pine trees and habitat. Consequently, my property is being invaded by chipmunks, golden mantilled ground squirrels, and gray squirrels, all of which are decimating my landscape. My understanding is that these are protected species, so what can I do to manage them? The gray squirrels are a particular problem and are far more damaging than the deer. Help! Exclamation mark, question mark.
Well, I'm wondering whether that person can potentially unmute. So what any of our thinking through solution is, what is the problem? So decimating the landscape, does that mean they are eating all the native plants, or are these non-native horticultural or garden plants? Not sure if our participants can help us with that. But I would say that going back to the tactics that I talked about, thinking about the scale, um, also assessing the issue. You've done some of that assessment work. These are native animals. They are now being excluded from part of their habitat, so they're having to find new areas in which to forage. So my solutions for you would be to choose native plants. Those are going to have the best defenses against excessive browsing or feeding by those native animals. And then if you have non-native plants that don't have those natural defenses, if those are potted plants, then you can use some of that hardware cloth to keep the squirrels from digging in the pots. If it's a garden, you can fence them out of that relatively small area. This is one of those times when thinking about smaller holes in the fencing, down low, up high, and maybe supplementing if you've got tree squirrels that are overtopping the fence with an electric wire. And also with tree squirrels, going back to that kind of fuzzy picture at the very beginning, thinking about, are they using structures or either built structures or tree limbs to essentially parachute into protected areas? You have to think about how you might cut off that highway overpass essentially.
Okay, thank you. Just an additional comment to the first question. P.S. To my question, the new developments are being done in phases, so the problem is not going to end anytime soon. Looking at 3 to 5 more years, I think you pretty much addressed
Yeah.
that question, but I added to it. Another comment here is thank you for the information on the rabbits. They're a huge problem too, so I am trying to get creative in keeping them out of my vegetable gardening containers, barrels. Any suggestions?
Well, the good news is that rabbits are not super great at climbing. They can climb a little bit. You might consider doing something if you have those specific barrels or raised beds, making that rabbit proof fence, that can't be dug under around where those things are. One potential, I don't know what the orientation of these containers is on your property. Another thing to consider would be during the height of growing season, you can go to online or in-person farm and ranch stores, or even something like Amazon or something, and get electrified poultry fencing, which is a very soft, you can just make it fit the shape of the little area of exclusion you need to, that won't go underground, obviously, but that could give you something movable that would be able to keep rabbits out, if the growing season especially is your most important need for exclusion.
Okay. Uh, our next question here is, do raptors and owls have any impact on burrowing animals like pocket gophers?
They do. Actually, that's a great question. I was actually just learning 2 weeks ago from a raptor expert colleague of mine that in some areas, pocket gophers are actually a really high percentage of some of the owl pellets they've been collecting along forest edges, which was a little surprising to me. I'm primarily a mammologist, and but pocket gophers are one of those burrowing animals about which we have much yet to learn, because it's virtually impossible essentially to put a radio collar on one to follow them around when they're underground and above ground. So yes, I would say that owls are probably the ones that get the better chance at them, because if they do come up above ground to forage outside the burrow system, and when the juveniles disperse, they get big enough and mom kicks them out of the house, then they're particularly vulnerable then. But also, these are one of those things that anything that goes in holes, snakes, I probably didn't emphasize enough, weasels, anything that is really designed to hunt in those burrow systems would also be very helpful if you can just allow those to exist and move across the landscape.
Thanks. Can you tell use about pack rats? Tell us about pack rats and how to exclude from vehicles.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Pack rats are cool little rodents. They look for that structure in which to build what we call middens, which is sticks and plant material and food caches, and then they pee on it all essentially to help glue it together and to mark their territory. And they also will take shelter in buildings and things that we don't think of as structures, like vehicles. Um, the the toughest part of that is going to be that you basically need to house that vehicle such that the rats can't get to it. And that's whether it's pack rats or a black rat or a brown rat or anything, or even house mice, frankly, I hear about getting into vehicles. It's Our vehicles are safe from predators, and we may not think of them being filled with food, but it's a lot of shelter, it's a lot of safety. And if they are easily accessed close to other accessible habitat, like outside, then they our RVs, our vehicles, our trucks just look like a great little cave. So sometimes parking, the trouble being that sometimes people don't have an enclosed concrete pad or or a garage or anything like that around which they could create exclusion. That can be really tricky.
Okay, thanks. Here's another question. Squirrels have girdled a Japanese maple that had to be removed. They have destroyed several shrubs, trees, and ground cover. They eat things I did not think they would eat, including natives. We are talking hundreds of dollars in damage. Cannot do electric wires, but do have a fence that they have mastered climbing. I cannot cut off all my tree limbs for them to stop parachuting into the yard. So I don't know if this is a question or this is a comment from above where the person was asking about the squirrels devastating her yard.
Well, it sounds like you've got a combination of both tree squirrels and ground squirrels there. So you have things burrowing and you also have things that are traveling in the trees. So those are two separate sets of creatures to manage. You can think about using hardware cloth to wrap the the stems to not only exclude around the perimeter of your new plantings, if you have burrowing animals, excluding, keeping that caging around those specimen plants to go below the surface. And anticipating, that you're going to have further problems with these sorts of things. As far as the tree squirrels, um, I I'm not sure what the damage is that's coming from those. It sounds like you may have California ground squirrels. They could climb a fence, but I'm not sure where that comes into the tree limbs being involved.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Here's another question from an attending. I have gopher pro I have a gopher problem in cycles.
Mhm.
Do I have to worry about gophers coming to abandoned tunnel
Mm.
systems after I have trapped original gopher?
Yeah,
Would trying to collapse tunnels help, or is it a waste of time?
that's a great question. So gophers, like I mentioned, they are territorial, surprisingly. So think about that burrow system as essentially now an empty apartment that's waiting to be leased by somebody, a dispersing animal that's going to say, "Oh, here's a burrow system, and no one's using it." Yes, they will move into that. So if you have the ability to collapse the tunnels or disrupt the tunnel systems, that is an option you can try. Be aware that if animals are able to construct burrows in your particular soil type, which it sounds like they are, that animals will construct new burrows. So uh, probably your longer term solution is going to be to trap and then monitor.
Okay. I'm going back to the person who was talking about the squirrels. There's just another comment. I'm not in an area where I am allowed to put anything electrified. I am in an HOA development, but thank you for the information.
Alrighty.
The next question is, how do you tell the difference between a vole, field mouse, and a house mouse?
Mhm. I'm not sure I have the images available here. Voles tend to have very short ears, and very relatively short tails. Um, I don't know what kind of field mouse you're talking about. There are many different types of native mice and rats that vary. We have several families and genera. And then house mice tend to be quite gray above and whitish below, have big ears and longer tails. Um, we do also see non-native black and brown rats showing up in areas that people think are too rural to have them, but both of those non-native invasive species are what we call commensal. Essentially, they move in with human cities, so you might possibly be thinking or encountering those. And that one figure I had pictures of identifying those two species. But as far as other native rodents, we probably have to get down to trying to figure out just what it is you're seeing, whether it's a kangaroo rat or there are a whole bunch of different rodents.
Okay. And our last question right now, although we may have a few more coming in. Here it is. Can applying coyote urine to ground around my parking area deter mice, rats from bedding in my truck?
Probably not.
Okay.
It's kind of like trying to use bad smell to keep deer from eating plants.
And that is all of our questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much for all this fantastic information. I'm going to share my screen again. And thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. Your feedback helps us to improve our webinars, so please remember to complete the survey. A huge thanks to Dana for the presentation. Oh, it looks like we might have one more question here. Let me double check. Oh, thanks, Dana. Great information as always.
My pleasure. And I'll send you a PDF of slides if that'll be helpful.
Okay, thank you so much. And with this, I will end the seminar. Everybody have a great afternoon and goodbye.